The Winnipeg Jets have downed the Bakersfield Condors in preseason action. Sure, they may have had the Edmonton Oilers name, but wasn't quite the Oilers starters. Let's chat about that on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey friends, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you like what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, like I said, the Winnipeg Jets just finished taking on the Edmonton Oilers in preseason action. Perhaps not the most thrilling of games, if we're being honest, in the sense that the Jets weren't exactly playing the highest end of Edmonton's roster. Let's be real, there's no McDavid, no Draisaitl, all that sort of stuff. So when I talk about this game, keep that context in mind. All that said, the Jets won in a 6-1 rollicking, absolutely demolishing victory. Winnipeg basically skated circles around the Bakersfield Condors, and so not super surprising that the scoreline was a little more than lopsided, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Before we go too much further, though, I did want to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, obviously the Jets were facing a less than NHL caliber lineup in the Oilers. Edmonton did not exactly send their best, which is not shocking. It's preseason. Sometimes teams don't really want to rush their starters and risk serious injuries for what is an evaluation period. I'd say preseason's probably more important for the Jets this time because Winnipeg is dealing with a number of different lineup changes, some young rookies, and there is a level of uncertainty about who's actually going to be starting for this team in a couple of weeks. And more importantly, how are they going to be starting, right? Who's going to be on what line? What players will go with which combos? And so that there, is a fair bit of uncertainty with this team. And I think for the Jets, having this time to get out the kinks and kind of experiment with some lineups probably isn't the worst. Now, the challenging thing, and perhaps the stuff that sort of irritated Jets fans immediately, is that, well, Winnipeg's lines have a slightly familiar feeling. In particular, Connor-Scheifele-Vilardi were reunited for this evening, and we have a long history with this line, and that the history, and I am joking, I'm being a little facetious, we don't have that much history with it, but the history that we did have is that it's been one of the hardest and most often struggling top lines the Jets have arranged. I thought that Vilardi might be able to help out Connor and Scheifele on the defensive side, but that trio just seems to be too slow and struggles to get out of its own ends. So, I think a lot of us are a little bit skeptical, but in tonight's game, credit to this line, they came out, they did what they needed to do, and in general, they bossed proceedings. You did see a couple of shifts where you saw some of those hints of what perhaps we've talked about in the past with them struggling with defensive zone exits. You saw some of that. But on the whole, I think, this Oilers roster didn't really pose too much of a challenge. And pretty early on, they created some good threats. They had a couple of good looks. And so, eventually Kyle Connor actually did get on the board on a beautiful breakaway that was just a perfect one-on-one, exactly what you want to see from one of your most gifted goal scorers. And overall, the line played pretty well. Vilardi had a couple of really good looks. Scheifele was attacking the slot area. I guess the biggest question is, how repeatable is this performance, right? You start facing real NHL caliber competition, and is this going to hold? And that's where I have a bit of skepticism. We've seen this line before not really do that well, and I'm not convinced that it's going to be fixed this season. But I could be wrong, right? Arneal is a new coach. The Jets haven't really played under him for any sustained period of time, and maybe this is the year that things take a turn. Maybe this line suddenly works and all of my concern ends up seeming silly. If Arniel can find a way to make this trio work, that would be pretty cool. Winnipeg would obviously have the ability to completely reconfigure its top six into something pretty threatening with two great like top six lines. But again, I'm just not sure that I see it yet. It could happen. It really could. And if it does, I would be very relieved because it seems like the Jets are going to be going with this trio anyways, regardless of some of the priors that we've seen. And, you know how I feel about that. Not always great, but I am willing to keep an open mind if I can see some evidence that it works. But we'll see. It's just the first game or first couple of games for preseason, so not going to lose my head over it and yell angrily like I've done in the past. What the Jets do at this point is what they do. You know, our input is minimal. We can only sit there and watch in happiness or horror at whatever the Jets do. In terms of guys who stood out in this game, you're probably wondering about Brad Lambert, who had a goal, an assist, and a penalty. I thought he looked okay. What I've kind of said about Lambert for a long time is that I just don't know if he's quite ready for the 2C role. I think that he will eventually become that kind of player, but right now, as he is, he seems still a little bit raw. I think, playing perhaps as a wide player really wouldn't be the worst way to start his career out. When I saw him, I thought that he had some really good shifts. He had some flashes. There were some nice plays, some good passes, some smart shots. But there were also moments where he looked a little overpowered. He had some passes and plays that I know at the NHL level would probably get picked off, turned into counters. And so there's just a level of rawness to his game that you're going to have to accept. And I think for me, that continues to kind of push towards the idea that maybe 2C is a little bit too ambitious to start the year. I think he's been placed in the top six here in that role in preseason as a show me what you can do. And if you can show that you can hang, you'll have that spot perhaps coming out of camp should Nemesnikov not be able to handle that competition. But I think Vlad is still the likely 2C. I think Lambert probably starts somewhere as a winger, and I don't hate that. I do think it wouldn't be the worst outcome. I know a lot of people are going to be upset, but I think given what we saw with Brad, he still has some work to do, and that's just going to have to come by playing at the NHL level. But I think after the first couple of months of action, I think he'll start to ramp up and look a lot more comfortable doing what we know that he can do. He's a super skilled player. He's a hardworking player. You saw him back-checking frequently, grinding in the corners, trying to win battles. He doesn't always do it well, but he tries, and I think that is a big thing that is a positive if you're an NHL coach. In terms of other takeaways, it's a little hard to say anything super, super definitive, but I mean, we are talking about an AHL lineup, right? Even Pionk absolutely cooked the Condors' defensive structure for a beautiful goal. So that kind of tells you the evening that it was. I will say, though, that the power plays that we did see from the Jets looked really fast. I liked the one-touch passing. I thought the way that the Jets honestly cooked on the power play with lots of overlaps, lots of positional changes, and constant puck movement was super refreshing. The first unit did not score, but came very close on multiple occasions. Some really dangerous railroad passes. It's all the stuff that I think you would really want to see from your top power play. The second unit did score. Thanks, Brad Lambert. He just decided, you know what, he was going to punch his number against Colin Delia and took it. So overall, that group looked good. The PK, I thought, looked all right. They were definitely more aggressive, and I think that there was actually a lot of rotation because if the high skater pressured the puck carrier, usually whoever the closest was on the diamond would rotate over, and the whole structure would kind of shift to essentially accommodate that and make sure that the positional and zonal marking was still intact, which is good, right? It allows these guys to keep shifting, keep applying pressure. Sometimes I did feel like they chased a little bit too aggressively and they got themselves in near trouble on a couple of shifts, but it's just part of the game, right? You are going to have to take risks. And I think with the Jets talking about playing Connor and Scheifele both on the PK, it does lend itself to the fact that, well, the Jets may give up some stuff, but they're also going to be looking to hunt down some shorthanded opportunities and apply pressure. So I like the way that Arniel is thinking, and, more aggression is probably a positive thing. Now, this game did not feature Cole Perfetti, and I want to chat about Perfetti because he did just sign an extension. Of course, they would do it while I'm away and unable to really record, but we'll chat about his extension and why I'm both happy about it and a little bit concerned in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, did want to shout out our friends and partners at FanDuel. NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Obviously, the start of the season has been super chaotic. The NFL is, well, honestly, if you're asking me personally, I feel a little unpredictable, a little mediocre to start. A lot of the top contenders have kind of stumbled out of the gates, which means that a lot of the middle of the pack teams and maybe even some surprising ones have risen to the top of the standings just a few weeks in. That means that if you've got a hunch about one of these squads, whether it's Washington, maybe you think the Bengals are going to turn it around, maybe you even think the Cowboys, with their disastrous start, are not as far off as they seem. Well, no matter what, when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets with FanDuel. You can make the most of your hunch right now, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's all on FanDuel.com. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are chatting about Jets preseason stuff, and obviously the game against the Oilers did not have Cole Perfetti. He finally just rejoined practice, and he rejoined practice because he's got a contract, and it is just a 2-year deal. It is, like 3.25 or 3.5 mil AAV. I think it was 3.25. Forgive me, I forget the exact number. I actually think it was 3.25 because I think the first year is 3 mil and the second year is 3.5. So honestly, that's basically what I thought the Jets were offering him. I felt like Winnipeg was trying to come under the Shane Pinto 3.75 per season, and 3.25 is cheap. My concern with this whole deal is that while it does give the Jets immediate cap savings on Perfetti's contract and is great value and certainly leaves them room to do stuff if they want to make trades or trade deadline acquisitions, I can't help but feel like Perfetti is going to have a really good 2 years and then get a huge raise that actually costs them more in the long run. And maybe the Jets aren't too worried about that. Part of me has also kind of considered the fact that maybe the Jets are trying to save a little bit in revenue because they're expecting maybe a bit of a downturn in attendance this year. Maybe they're not trying to spend as much on wages because they think that, the Jets could be a more bubbly team. Maybe that means seats are a little emptier. And so maybe they're not trying to spend deep into the pockets as much as they usually do. I want to say that somewhere in the offseason, I think Chipman or somebody in the adjacent to him suggested the Jets were not necessarily spending to the cap this year. And if that's the case, I sort of understand it. I just feel like if you knew that you didn't want to pay Perfetti long-term, and it sounds like there was no long-term deal offered to Perfetti in the first place, then why did it take you so long to arrive at a deal that was like $500K less per season than what Perfetti was asking? I just feel like there was a lot of song and dance. Perfetti missed a couple of days of camp, and it didn't really seem like that big of a gap to where I felt like potentially impacting the relationship long-term was worth it. Not that I think you should give into every player demand, but like 3.75 mil per season for Perfetti is more than fair. He's going to be worth that. He's going to be good. And so I hope it didn't really damage things. I don't get the sense that Perfetti himself was super offended or anything. I think he understands that it is part of the business, but he had reiterated recently that he's interested in a long-term deal. And the fact that no long-term deal was offered, for me, is a little odd. I just sort of ask myself, in a couple of years, are the Jets going to regret this? And it's entirely possible that the opposite happens, and we're all like, wow, I'm glad that wasn't signed because something with Perfetti has changed. His health maybe takes a turn for the worse. Maybe he doesn't look like the player that we thought he was going to be. It's this business is all about making smart gambles, and I feel like this was probably not one that I would have made, right? A 2-year gamble just feels like you're playing with a little bit of fire for his next contract. But hey, it is what it is. For the meantime, the Jets have a great player at a very low, cap hit, relatively speaking. And it does leave them room to maybe solve the third pairing left-sided D problem, or if they want to get ambitious, maybe they try and make a trade for a bigger player and move some salary out in the process. So there's a lot of stuff the Jets could do. I just hope that at the end of it, they don't, end up putting themselves in a worse position long term, because the next 2 seasons I've not really considered to be particularly competitive. It'd be one thing if the Jets were really fighting for, a lot of competitive streaks, maybe a real big playoff seed, a deep playoff run, but that's not where I feel the team is this year. I think the Jets are not rebuilding, but they're definitely kind of in the middle of that retool. And, there's a huge influx of youth. I think there's going to be a bit of a step back in the regular standings. And I just ask myself, is that cap space really going to matter this year, or even conceivably next year? Maybe it will. Maybe the Jets have some grand plan, and I'm just not thinking far ahead enough. But I'm asking myself, given the Jets' history and how they've usually used that cap space, I'm not entirely convinced. I could be wrong, right? This is just from an outsider's perspective. Winnipeg may have a very clear plan on what they want to do with that money, but given how they've used space in the past, I'm a little bit cautious about it. And I just don't think that whatever they bring in is really going to move the needle to get this team into a really deep playoff competitive spot. Maybe there's a big surprise somewhere. Maybe there's a huge blockbuster trade we have yet to think about, but I would guess that they just wanted to save on the cash over the next couple of years, and they're banking on Perfetti essentially sort of breaking even on the amount that they pay him on his next deal. The difference between like the $6 or so million that they might have saved over the next 2 years versus however much he was going to ask for anyways at the end of it on his next long-term contract. So I see it a couple of different ways. I just feel like this was probably not the way that I would have gone about it. But all that said, if you've got him now for that contract, you better make the most of it. He is a great player. I think he's really going to be my breakout candidate of the season. I wouldn't be shocked if he hits like 50 or 60 points this year. He already hit 38 playing like fourth line minutes last year. If he stays healthy and gets a really big role under Arniel, which does seem to be the way that Scott is leaning, I do think that this season could be really the year of Perfetti. I'm excited about him. I think that he's a great player. I've been waiting a long time for a Jets staff member to actually take notice of him and really understand what he's good at, because once he starts to feel comfortable and confident at this level, I think the world is really his oyster going forward. I'd be curious to know, though, what you predict for his season. Give me your Cole Perfetti season predictions in the comments below or at my social medias at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For what it's worth, Lambert was playing with Nemesnikov and Ehlers tonight. Perfetti perhaps would get on that trio at some point. I don't really know what Arniel's plan is here, because if you have Connor-Scheifele-Vilardi, you could do maybe Perfetti, Lambert, and Ehlers, which is a way to potentially compensate for some of Lambert's defensive liabilities to start. I don't think Lambert's going to be bad defensively, but I think he's going to have some early struggles, and Perfetti might be able to compensate for those nicely. Then you could have like Lowry, Niederreiter, and whoever on the third line, and a fourth line that somehow involves Nemesnikov. But I don't know how the Jets are going to arrange this. They've got a lot of players, probably too many forwards, and not enough roster spots for everyone. So that's where the front office, I really feel like, has to make some moves. But we'll see what they do. Maybe they're not that interested in it. Maybe they're okay rolling the sort of depth that they have now. But you ask me, it might behoove you to move some of the salary that's not as valuable to you if you can turn it into a good piece to help for the present and the future. But I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. I think we all sort of know how this Jets team tends to operate. And speaking of knowing how the team operates, I did think it was worth talking about the Jets potentially repeating cycles under Arniel. CSV is back. Is that what we want to see? Are the Jets doomed to do the same thing over and over again? What should we take away from Scott's Arniel early tenure with the Jets so far? We'll get to that in just a moment, but before we do, did want to shout out all of our friends at Indeed. We're all driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match, and you can match with Indeed. Indeed ditches the busy work for you by helping you schedule, screening, and message so you can do it all in one platform and connect with candidates faster. Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers agree Indeed delivers the highest quality candidate matches compared to other job sites. As somebody who has actually used Indeed when I was looking for work, I can personally attest to the fact that their resume building system is detailed, comprehensive, and actually aligns pretty nicely when I search for a job. It matches stuff that fits my qualifications, my salary ask, all of that stuff. It's all taken care of. It's all very convenient. So I can only imagine how easy it is for an employer to use the site when they're looking for great candidates. And that's why over 3.5 million businesses worldwide already use Indeed. You should become one of them because all of our listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on the Locked On Winnipeg Jets podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we are just wrapping up really quickly with a broader question about the Jets repeating cycles of stuff that they've done multiple times, perhaps too many times, and perhaps whether or not Scott Arniel is going to break some of those habits. The first habit that they have apparently kind of committed to already, seemingly, is keeping Scheifele and Connor together, which there is a way to make it work, and that's playing those two with Ehlers. I don't think Vilardi is going to be able to do what Ehlers does with the transition game that is really needed against top opponents. Connor and Scheifele are much better with Nick than they are with Vilardi. Gabriel, I like him a lot. He's a really good player. I don't know if he's going to be the guy that can carry those two when they're trying to get the puck up the ice and struggling under pressure from opponents. So that is kind of one concern. The other concern is are the Jets really going to try to make Logan Stanley happen this year? Stanley, bless his heart, he really tries and he really does, fight for the badge. But I don't know if he's really that great for what the Jets are asking of him, especially on the third pair that's likely going to feature Colin Miller. Miller, speaking of which, he's like the first way that you might say the Jets are breaking a cycle because he got benched a lot last year, and it seems like he is already proving why that was a huge mistake. And given that he got a 2-year deal, it does seem like he figures pretty prominently into the Jets' plans. So that in and of itself is good news, but otherwise, we do see a lot of the same stuff with Winnipeg that we've seen in the past, and some, habits die hard. The Jets have tried to really save a lot of cash, or as much as they can on the Perfetti deal, which the negotiations were kind of like a little odd to me. But I hope that Winnipeg is really able to move on from some of their old habits. This analytics conference in the summer, what came out of it? How does that really impact the team? At least with the special teams coaching, I do feel like it did make a considerable impact there. And Arniel is expressing, in some ways, some changes to the formula that I think are, on the whole, positive. But, I wonder if Winnipeg can't quite escape its own shadow sometimes. This team has at times felt like it's locking itself behind certain doors or certain patterns of behavior. And it has haunted this team in the past and really stunted its ability to grow. I'm hoping that we've kind of moved past that, and I'm hoping that some of the stuff that they have gotten wrong before, they're going to get right in the future. I think we've already started to see some of that organizationally speaking with how the Jets have drafted, how they're building for the future, and I think that there's been a focus on some of the right areas to start growing this team going forward. But we may have to kind of suffer through some rougher periods for the next few years as the Jets maybe change some stuff, maybe try to figure out how to take that next step forward. This team is already in my mind, on a better path than it was in previous seasons, but to me, there's still a long way to go. And if Arniel ends up being more of Bonus and Maurice, I don't know that that's necessarily what I was looking for, right? But I don't know that Arniel is going to be that either. He does talk in a way that's different from a lot of the other coaches, and I feel like for some reason I'm just inclined to give him a little more credence until he proves that I'm wrong about this, right? I feel like I don't know. He seems to be more open-minded. He's talked the right aspects of the team that need work. He seems to spotlight things that I would say are big problem areas. And it's stuff that perhaps other coaches maybe mentioned before but didn't really know how to fix. Arniel seems like he's maybe better about trying to actively address it. Again, it's hard to read into some of this stuff until we really see on a routine basis how he carries it out and sort of executes it with the team. But all that to say, I'm just hoping that this is the era of the Jets where we start to get back to what made the team so special in 17 and 18. We haven't had a team that's felt like young, fast, and skilled in a while, and I think that that's the direction the Jets need to go to. It's sort of funny because it sort of parallels what happened following 2014-15 when the Jets got swept. Winnipeg started to draft young talent, started to implement more ELCs, and in the following years, there were some really rough patches in between, but eventually it coalesced into a squad that was, one of the best in the NHL. And it happened when you transitioned from the heavier, slower, more physical 14-15 squad to the faster, more skilled the 2017-2018 Jets, right? And it still carried elements from the previous team, but it built upon it in a meaningful way. And I wonder if this Jets team might be starting to move towards that going forward. All I hope for is that Perfetti, Lambert, Hanela, all these guys contribute to the future. Jagger's coming soon. Julian and Walton perhaps are NHLers. Zilkin, all of these guys I'm figuring to be some sort of NHLer at some point. It's just a bit of a question as to how good they're going to be. Shubrakov as well. Solomonson's coming soon. So there's stuff to work with, and you also have plenty of good veterans to rely on in the meantime. So let's not repeat the wrong parts of the past, but go back to the fun parts where this team was a squad that other teams were afraid of. I remember when Vegas specifically traded for Brassard so the Jets could not get him, and instead they just went out and got, Paul Stastny. So all is well that ends well if you're the Winnipeg Jets. But I'd be curious to know if you're thinking this team is doomed to repeat some of its same mistakes, or do you feel that the Jets have learned? I'm 50-50 on it in some ways, but I'm wanting to be more optimistic going forward. I just need to see a little bit more from this team that really convinces me the squad is ready to take that next step. I've seen signs of it, and I think that that's very promising, and that's what I want to see. But now it's actually seeing them take it to the next level and move forward as a franchise. But let me know your thoughts on all of this in the comments below. What stood out to you as well with the preseason stuff? Are you upset about Perfetti's new contract? Whatever you're feeling, drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. It will probably throw you to know that in just a little bit over a week and a half or so, we are finally getting back to the actual regular season hockey. It has been too long. It'll be nice when preseason is over. This is the longest 2 weeks for a lot of hockey fans, and we are so close to the promised land of facing off against the Oilers again to start the season. So, as always, we will have more off-season coverage, or preseason coverage in this case, over the next couple of days. Until then, though, have a great night, and as always, go Jets go.